Starting. There we go. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. My name is Scott Ritter with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, and I'm going to be leading the presentation today, where we are introducing the kind of pods concept and context within the Northern Colorado Fireshed, specifically to lead us all into the workshops this week, where we'll be revising and expanding the current Arapaho and Roosevelt National Forest pods network. So you can see my collaborators here who helped out on the presentation. And I go ahead, and here is our agenda. So we're going to have a variety of people speaking to you today, who will introduce themselves as they come up. But in terms of our agenda, we're going to start off with some kind of higher level leaders' intent and direction, and discuss the larger workshop purpose. Then we will enter kind of just a background overview of what are pods, how's the framework, what does the framework look like, how can it be used, and then what's the process look like for developing pod networks. Then we'll discuss the context within the Northern Colorado Fireshed, as well as applications on the National Forest. We'll do a little overview of some of the analytical products and fire modeling that support pods development and application. And then we'll just have a little bit of wrap up and discussion of our next steps for the week. And then we'll go ahead and set aside a chunk of time at the end for any questions that anybody has at this point in the process. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Jason Sieg to give a little leader's intent, and then we'll go through kind of some more of that overview. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Hey, everyone. Jason Sieg. I'm the Deputy Forest Supervisor here on the Arapaho Roosevelt National Forest and Pawnee National Grassland. Excited to be here with you all today. One thing I've noticed over the time that I've been on this forest, and I've been here for about a year, is this forest is situated in a very complex and dynamic environment. Geographically, where the forest sits here in this part of Colorado, there's a lot of stuff you have to work through when you're trying to tackle an issue or find a solution or work through something. And what I found is effective here on the ARP is working together and collaborating with others, and then also developing a strategy. Those two pieces seem to lead to successful outcomes for us on the forest. And so that's one of the reasons we're all here together today, is to work together, to collaborate, and hone in on some strategy. And so I'm so excited to see a number of folks here on the roster, a number of partners and individuals I work with on a routine basis. So great to see all of you, and look forward to meeting the folks who are new to me. So this idea of pods, I first engaged with the pods concept back in 2018. I was working out in California on the El Dorado National Forest at that time. And this idea of creating pods boundaries across the forest hit our forests back then. And at that time, it was our fire managers or fire leaders on the forest expressing the need to look at the landscape across the forest and develop geographic areas where we could effectively suppress and manage a fire if it was to occur on the forest. And so at that time, it was very much centered around fire suppression activities and developing a strategy to be effective in suppressing fires. So our forest went on a bit of a pods journey back then, many years ago. And that was a great experience. And as I've kind of seen the pods idea grow and change over the last 5 or 6 years, it's a really exciting time, especially here on the ARP, You know, the ARP started developing pods boundaries many years ago, similar to the El Dorado National Forest. And, you know, some of that initial groundwork that was done years ago is now serving us really well as we try and tackle the wildfire crisis strategy on the landscape. So we all know here on the Front Range, we've got, you know, high fuel loading. We've had years of drought and dry conditions, and, you know, years like 2020 show us that we are a landscape that is very susceptible to large catastrophic wildfire. And so as we look to tackle that issue together collectively, pods is a great tool to help us not only develop a strategy, but also look at creating some common language, some common operating pictures between, you know, Forest Service staff, fire staff, non-fire Forest Service staff, regional leadership, and many of our partners. You know, pods is it's kind of a new take on an old concept that fits very well here on the ARP in our fire management planning efforts. You know, I mentioned pods, at least for me years ago, started as a suppression tool. While it still very much is a suppression tool that we can use, there's, you know, there's other applications that have popped up in recent years, and that's around being more strategic with our pre-fire planning. So where could we be doing different treatments that will set up the landscape to start addressing some of these fire concerns? And so pods is a great way to kind of look at the whole spectrum of fire, you know, being proactive and doing treatments ahead of time, responding to a fire incident, and then also allowing fire managers and firefighting personnel who come in as part of a management team to be able to speak a similar language and look at our pods strategy and kind of take that and run with it when there is an incident on the forest or on the landscape. You know, I mentioned wildfire crisis strategy. This pods effort aligns very well with national initiatives, our Forest Service agency initiatives, such as the wildfire crisis strategy. And it's just a great way for us all to kind of center ourselves and really gather around a common language and understanding of what we're trying to do across the landscape. So I'm super excited for today and these next few days as we break out into these day-long sessions in different geographic areas. There's a lot of great information that's going to be presented today through not only this PowerPoint, but a number of our partners and subject matter experts who've been working much more closely with pods over the last few months or year here on the forest. And so really just encourage you all to engage today. A lot of great information, ask questions. Although it doesn't always seem like it, the Forest Service, we strive to be a learning organization, and that's very much what we like to be here on the ARP is, you know, we may not know it all, and that's okay, but collectively as a larger group, we can tackle these issues together. So again, excited to be here. This is very timely with where we're at, moving out and wanting to plan long-term strategic treatments, both fuels reduction, prescribed fire, managing fire. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to Karina. I think Karina's next. Karina is one of our facilitators for the NOCO Fire Shed, and super excited to have her joining us today as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, I just wanted to give a little background, I think, just to add on to what Jason was just describing of the way that we collaborate in this landscape. So like Jason said, my name is Karina Marshall. I coordinate the NOCO Fire Shed. And I do so, I'm an employee of the Ember Alliance, and I coordinate the fire shed. So the landscape that we're in is on the map here. So we have federal, state, local partners, NGOs from the Wyoming border down to I-70 along the Front Range, and then Grand County on the other side of the Continental Divide. So, you know, we're working as a collective group to engage with communities, promote resilient forests and watersheds, and protect highly valued resources and assets. And like Jason said, pods are quickly becoming a really useful tool for managing that large workload. So we know, we want to have treatments that are coordinated and actually make a difference on the landscape, and kind of bridging and connecting them together. And this pods work gives us a framework to do that. So getting these lines right is really useful to us as a Fireshed Collaborative. It's useful to our federal, state, agency partners. It's useful to NGOs thinking about how to fit in local treatments into that bigger landscape, adding up to something that we can kind of point to at a strategic and landscape scale. Could somebody mute whatever that loud crashing is? But so I think just to kind of put a bow on that, the NOCA Fireshed's vision is that our landscapes are prepared to receive and recover from wildfire in ways that minimize the catastrophic impacts to watersheds and the communities that we all serve. So all of this kind of comes together in this landscape where we're trying to figure out what is a strategic plan that we can have that fits and supports work at the local private landowner level and connects it all the way up to the federal level. So my role here is to help make sure that's happening and help make sure that folks who are getting work done on the ground are connected into this larger landscape strategy, especially with the WCS investment in our landscape. We really want to get this right and show what we can do. So I'm just really excited to see this move forward and update these pod boundaries, getting more good data and more structure to the collaborative environment. And with that, I will pass it to Tony.
You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
We got you.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Is there an echo? Okay. Sorry, having technical difficulties. After all this time, thanks teams. Thanks to everybody. I just wanted to introduce folks to the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, why we're here as part of this effort and why we are hosting this workshop, give some folks a background. Many of you probably have interfaced with CFRI over the months and years, and some of you might be new. So just wanted to provide that as a background and how the work we're doing in the NOCA Fireshed with regards to not only pods, but a lot of the other work we're doing also relates to some of the larger efforts in the wildfire crisis strategy and beyond. So CFRI is an entity of Colorado State University. So we're a university-based applied research and outreach organization. We were established through an act of Congress. There's two other institutes that were established through that act, one at Northern Arizona University and one at New Mexico Highlands University. And we are located within the College of Natural Resources and in the Forest and Rangeland Stewardship Department. I'm also a faculty member in that department. And we were really set up back in 2004 at a time when there were some very large, uncharacteristic fires back in those days. Some of the early times that really kind of provide an awakening about this wildfire crisis issue. The Hayman fire in 2002 was our local fire here in Colorado that burned about 137,000 acres southwest of Denver. And that really prompted a whole variety of interagency and multi-partner collaborative efforts to address the forest health, fire issues through fuel reduction. And even back then, it was very much acknowledged that we needed more fire on the landscape. We were operating in a fire deficit, like many landscapes across the Western U.S. But to get more fire on the landscape, we needed to prepare those landscapes and those communities to receive those fires. And so that hasn't changed. That's still a mission of the NOCO Fireshed Collaborative. The NOCO Fireshed Collaborative is kind of the latest entity of that long string of collaborative efforts that date back to 2003, 2004. So we really operate at that interface of developing and deploying the best available science and integrating with local place-based knowledge to make sure that that knowledge is actionable and people on the ground have the information they need, but not only the managers, but also their community-connected partners, which is a really foundational way of actually being able to do that work. We have a variety of program focal areas that you can see there, but a major one is in wildfire risk assessment and decision support. And Scott works as part of that team, as a leader in that team. We first got involved with the potential operational delineations framework and tool back in 2018, when it was really starting to go from the science shop in the Rocky Mountain Research Station and being deployed into a variety of national forest units. Jason mentioned that El Dorado was one of them, several in Region 3. And the ARP here in Region 2 was one of the first that also had some of those early generation workshops. And so we really got on the ground floor of pods and continue to be a partner with the Rocky Mountain Research Station and their wildfire management risk science team, along with Oregon State University, in deploying pods across the Western U.S. So we've been involved in co-developing and deploying pods for most national forests in Region 2, as well as many national forests in Region 4, which encompasses Wyoming, the Bridger Teton in Wyoming, southern Idaho, and almost all of the national forests in Utah. So we bring a lot of learning and experience, and we're learning as well along with the Forest Service and other partners. One of the things that we've learned is that it's not just the lines on the map, but also what you do inside those pods. And that's something that I think is also a big focus of not only today's presentation, but the work that the variety of workshops in the next few days. So really appreciate everybody's engagement in this. Pods only have meaning, only work when you have many people involved, the different kinds of jurisdictions, the different types of managers working together to really co-create that knowledge of how pods can be used as a management approach and a strategy. Yeah, so with that, I'll turn that over. Who am I turning it over to? Back to Scott?
Back to me for a second here. I think, yeah, getting an echo off you, Tony. Thanks. All right. So thanks, Tony and Jason and Karina for those intros. So I'm just going to hone in a little bit more specifically on what we're going to be doing here this week. So obviously, we've said it a few times, but the ARP pod network was first developed in 2018. And, as everyone should be well aware, there have been some large fire events since that network was developed, as well as a lot of lessons learned on how to use pods, what make good lines and things like that. So there's a need to revise the existing network, as well as expand the network. So on this map here, I've got the wildfire crisis strategy landscape boundary. Certainly extending east to that boundary, as well as going even further off to have coverage across the whole Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative landscape is a goal for the workshop. And then also we're going to have some representation from Rocky Mountain National Park, to go ahead and get some pods across that landscape as well. So we can use this as a sort of cohesive planning framework across our whole landscapes. So those are the major goals. You know, as we've expanded this, it'll help with the wildfire crisis strategy planning and prioritization, as well as a lot of the spatial strategy work going on in the NOCO fireshed specifically. So there's the context. Definitely look forward to the workshops this week. So up next, we're going to have my colleague Tyler kind of walk through some more background for people who are a little newer to the framework on what pods are, how we develop them, and a little bit on how we use them. So yeah, go ahead, Tyler.
Great, thanks, Scott, and good afternoon, everyone. So Tyler Beaton, like Scott said, I'm a program manager at CFRI and have been heavily involved in developing and applying pods throughout national forest units in Region 2 and Region 4. Just to set the context, I want to provide a little bit of context about why pods, and then talk about what they are, how they're developed, and how they can be used. But just to set the context here, most of this doesn't need repeated for this audience, but just to get everyone on the same page, we all know that fire management decisions are made under intense time constraints, and they're often made with imperfect understanding of what is the fire behavior. So what's the fire going to do? What are the effects of the fire going to be on the things that we care about? And where are we going to contain it? What are the opportunities for control? So fundamentally, pods provides a solution to this because it allows a pre-fire planning analysis to engage the fire before it starts. So using pods as a framework, you can consider both land and resource management objectives before there's smoke in the air and you're in an emergency situation. You can think about what are the potential fire control locations and what is their probability of containment, and think about what are the hazards to firefighters. Where are the places in the landscape where I'd want to put firefighters, and where are the places in the landscape where I wouldn't? And then finally, what are the fire behavior and effects under these different conditions and considerations? All right, next, Scott. So what are pods? Pods are this spatial fire planning framework. To date, they've been developed on over 70 national forests and counting. They fundamentally, what pods are doing, it's a process to pre-identify what are the most effective control lines across the landscape that have a high likelihood of containing a fire. And as Jason mentioned, this is a framework that really builds upon a long-standing practice of any firefighter who goes onto a fire and sizes up a landscape by looking at those roads, those rivers, and those ridges that have a high likelihood of containing fire. The pods framework really approximates that big box strategy, so that confine and contain strategy that firefighters have used for a long time in order to manage fire. So the concept itself is not novel. The novel piece about it is having folks come together to identify these control features before smoke is in the air, so that when there is smoke in the air, we already have a pre-identified locations of where we want to control that fire, and where we can and where we cannot. So pods are essentially operationally relevant management units. So you can think of them as essentially a spatial container. It's a spatial container that's surrounded on all sides by control features. So this is an example of a pod network on the Pike San Isabel, so just south of us. And just a few important caveats to mention before we get too far into it. One is that, as was mentioned, I think by Jason, is that pods are designed to be cross-boundary, and that's because fire doesn't know jurisdictional boundaries, and nor should the planning approach use to plan for them. These lines delineate the potential for control, the best potential for control. They're not guaranteed to hold a fire, and in fact, under most circumstances, will need some improvement in order to be an effective control feature. Pods are a decision support tool. so they don't tie your hands to any fixed management strategy. And there's many cases where there's other variables that are at play that are going to affect where you hold up or contain a line. Really, the overarching goal here is to take that collective 100 years of intimate fire management knowledge that some folks have of the landscape, getting it into a GIS system so that you can institutionalize that knowledge and form a broader landscape strategy, and provide an opportunity to hand this off to incident management teams who may not be familiar with the landscape. Okay, next slide. So there's a lot of national direction and policy that's geared towards pods. There's, as many of you know, the bipartisan infrastructure law provided $100 million for the Secretary of Interior and the Secretary of Ag to do effectively what we're doing now, to do pods workshops and also workforce training. Another $500 million has went directly to those entities in an effort to promote for developing and improving potential control locations, or those pod boundaries. And then with that, the bipartisan infrastructure law introduced a new categorical exclusion that allowed for developing fuel breaks along pod boundaries. We're also seeing a lot of direction in the prescribed fire review, recent chief's letters, and also with the most recent Federal Wildfire Commission recommendations that explicitly call out the importance and need for pods. You can go to the next, Scott. So how are pods developed? There's a few different components that go into developing pods. First and foremost is local expertise and knowledge. So I kind of alluded to this before, but the key point and variable here is bringing together the collective knowledge of folks who have intimate experience and knowledge about how fire behaves on a landscape, and getting it into a system that can be shared with others. We like to pair that local expertise and knowledge with some sophisticated spatial analytics that were developed and maintained by the Rocky Mountain Research Station, specifically those that look at suppression difficulty and probability of success. And I'll talk about those a little bit in the next couple slides, and Scott's going to go into a lot of detail about what those models are actually doing. We take those two pieces and combine it into a collaborative process, multiple day workshops, which is what you're going to be doing over the next few days, and have some discussion and dialogue about where the most effective control lines are and where they aren't, and specifically getting at this notion of where's the right ridge and not necessarily the next ridge, or where's the right ridge to contain, or right road to contain a fire and not necessarily the next road. Okay, Scott. So I'll just introduce these briefly because I know Scott's going to go into a little bit more detail. But as I mentioned before, PODS leverages that local knowledge and expertise, and it incorporates some spatial analytics. So namely, the two that we used the most is the suppression difficulty index. So that's the map or the figure there on the left, and the potential control locations, which is the figure on the right. So the SDI, or suppression difficulty index, is essentially highlighting areas across the landscape where it's easier or safer to operate versus where it's harder or more hazardous. So it identifies those areas that are of high risk to fire responder safety. So the figure on the left is showing you those cooler colors are those areas where it's easier or safer to contain a fire or to suppress a fire, whereas those in red are much harder and more hazardous to firefighters. The figure on the right is called the potential control locations analysis. This is an empirical model, so it's based on past observations of not only where a fire has stopped in the past, but what has contributed to it stopping in the past. So the final product or final map that you get is a surface showing you the probability of success of containing a fire at a particular place in a landscape. Okay, next, Scott. So I wanted to just introduce those briefly because those analytics, because I want to walk through just a kind of quick overview of what this collaborative process is going to look like and what the mapping sessions are going to look like over the next couple of days. So the way that we've done this, and CFRI has kind of evolved our model and process over time, but we've done this on about 22 landscapes at this point. And typically what we'll do is we'll have this PODS 101 presentation like we're doing right now. And then we'll have these series of mapping sessions. So you'll have a series of mapping sessions over the next few days where we get folks in the room. We have a big projector screen with the GIS, and we have all of these layers laid out. So we'll have the potential control locations analysis, suppression difficulty index, and a number of reference layers to kind of situate the experts in the room. And then we go through the mapping exercise. So we have folks who will pull up different geographic areas in the landscape and start talking about where are the most effective places in the landscape to contain a fire, and where are those relevant to the values and risks that we care about. Where are there areas that we can't contain a fire, or where are there areas where this might be a good line, but it would need a lot of improvement. So we have that collaboration, we have that discussion, we have that dialogue to start to get to essentially a map of the most effective control features on a landscape, which is kind of illustrated by the bottom right here. So throughout this mapping exercise, Scott and/or Jackie from CFRI will be kind of digitizing these lines in real time and capturing the discussion around what makes a good line and what makes a not so good line. At the end of the day, you'll have a very rough draft of that new PODS network. It's important to mention that it is a draft and that goes through a lot of phases of kind of post-processing. It'll need to be ground truth and verified by fire managers on the ground. But at the end of the day, you have a really good starting point for the next stage of building out your landscape strategy. And just a quick point is that the product of developing PODS on your landscape is important, but just as important is the process itself, and having folks come together to build shared understanding and agreement about where those most effective lines are, and in the preseason before smoke is in the air can really help clear up any misunderstandings for when a fire does occur. So next slide, please. So this is a slide that we typically like to put up and get people thinking. So the next few days, for those of you who are in your respective mapping sessions, whenever those are,
Looks like we lost Tyler.
hey, sorry, I think I got lost. You got me back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, sorry. I'm in a hotel room in Santa Fe, so I apologize if I lose you. Should have good connection. So the first question that we kind of lead off with, and this is kind of how it sets up the mapping process sometimes, is what is the fire that keeps you up at night, and where is it? Where does it start and where does it go? What's the fire behavior like? What are the values at risk? Who is impacted by this fire? And then where would you like to contain it? And why would you contain it there and not somewhere else? How successful could you be under what conditions? This gets at this notion of not all PODS lines are created equal. A highway is much more effective than a 2-track, and a 2-track is more effective than a trail. So those are the kinds of things that we want to try to document when we're going through this process. And then who have you discussed this with, and how are you going to communicate your plan for how you would contain this fire? So at the end of the day, after you get your PODS lines developed, there's a number of products that come from this, from the very basic to some more analytically heavy products, I would say. So you have, at the very basic level, you have a map of the control lines, hard copy maps for planning. We're seeing them integrated within WFDS, Avenza, Field Collector, online maps and dashboards, and we're seeing them more and more used in community wildfire protection plans. And I'll provide a little example here in a minute about how you might think about incorporating PODS into those. And then the final one is if you think of PODS as a spatial container, right? And it's surrounded on all sides by containment features. Within that pod, you can summarize spatial information that's relevant for you for fuels planning, for treatment prioritization and or for fire response. So Scott in particular and CFRI has been heavily engaged in developing these pod atlases, either as PDF maps or more recently as more of an ArcGIS online program where you can summarize hazards, quantitative risk assessments, other things within that to inform both fuels planning and treatment prioritization. And this gets at the notion that Tony mentioned before, that where the pods are is important, but just as important as what's inside those pods for fire management and fuels planning. Okay, next. Okay, so pods are very often combined with the quantitative wildfire risk assessments. Scott's going to go into detail about what's been done for the fire shed, so I won't go into it too much, but just to say that QRAs, if you're not familiar with them, essentially are integrating the intensity and likelihood of fire and how that intersects with values and resources that we care about, and what are the likely impacts, both positive and negative, to those resources that we care about. So you can combine a QRA with what's referred to as strategic response objectives or strategic response zones, and all these do is they essentially summarize that risk assessment information within that operationally relevant management unit, so within that pod unit. And it can then be used as a mechanism for thinking about what your fire management strategies are going to be when a fire does occur. So just to give you a couple examples, that this kind of categories that we see here on the map on the right, those in red are referred to protect zones. So essentially what that means is that all the values and resources that we care about within that pod are under most conditions going to be negatively impacted by fire. So if we have the opportunity and the means and it's safe to do so, we should be using direct suppression tactics. On the other end of the spectrum, those in green are what's referred to as manage zones or categories. And what those refer to is the risk or the values and resources that we care about within that pod may respond positively to fire under some conditions. So again, if it's safe and effective to do so, and if you have the resources at hand, you might want to consider to manage that fire for resource benefit or for other objectives. So again, just like pods themselves, this is a decision support tool. It does not tie your hands to any kind of fixed management strategy. It's just a way to identify before smoke is in the air. What are some of the tactics we might take on a fire in these different places? So pods are relevant for a number of different things, and I'm going to go into a few details, but just kind of the bullets here are that they're useful for pre-season planning across boundaries. They've been useful for communication before, during, and after incidents. More and more, we're seeing them used to inform incident management decisions. And while this was initially developed, the framework was initially developed for incident management, we're seeing them more and more used, and we'll see examples here in a minute of how they're being used for treatment prioritization and fuel management decisions. So wanted to provide some local examples here. This is Mike Caggiano led an effort to provide a review or synthesis about how pods and other spatial analytics were used on the Cameron Peak fire. We're all very familiar with that fire. It started in 2020 in August and lasted almost 90 days. And became the largest fire in Colorado history. So through this synthesis, what we found was that pods were used really to help delineate the initial fire planning areas. As soon as fire managers realized that this was going to be a long duration event, they used pods and other containment features to delineate their initial fire planning areas. We also found really good alignment between pods and the final fire perimeter. So around 30% of the final fire perimeter were pod boundaries, and over 60% of the constructed improved control lines were also pod boundaries. So as Tony mentioned, ARP developed pods initially in 2018. And when they developed pods, they also developed a treatment strategy, the so-called ribbon approach, running north to south, where along these areas to try to moderate fire behavior from the west to east and burn and some integrate that behavior to the east, where there were values and resources that they cared about. So they weren't able to get to all of those treatments along that ribbon, but where they did, those treatments that were thin and burned along pod lines had a very positive effect on moderating fire behavior and really changed the outcome of the Cameron Peak fire. And then finally, the pods were developed interagency across agencies, and it was also used very clearly during the fire across agencies to coordinate activities. Next slide, please. So this is just a schematic that that we've been kind of noshing on for a while, and gets at this notion of how you might go about iteratively improving treatments and hardening pod boundaries over time. So as I mentioned before, many of the lines that you map are going to need improvement, and either that's going to be during the incident or ideally before an incident. So what this schematic is trying to show is on the left here, this left image is showing you essentially you've went through the pods mapping process and you've identified some troublesome pod boundaries on the landscape. Maybe this is just for an example. Maybe this is an important evacuation corridor and it's adjacent to some important community values. So in its current form, there's no treatment being done. The probability for control along that area is minimal. So what you might want to consider is along these prioritized boundaries, you could think about putting in some shaded fuel breaks to increase the probability for control. So that's kind of delineated by this middle image here. But as we all know, fuel breaks can increase potential for control, but there's a lot of other factors that go in to whether a fuel break is effective or not. Are there firefighting resources on hand? How long ago was the treatment? What is the fire weather behavior like that, like at this time, et cetera, et cetera. So in order to increase firefighter safety and effectiveness and reduce future fire risk and hopefully promote proactive fire management in the future, like prescribed fire, you might want to think about iteratively improving those lines and hardening those pod boundaries through mechanical and prescribed fire treatments, and hopefully linking those to some more broader landscape scale treatments that can not only increase firefighter safety and effectiveness, but hopefully promote proactive fire management in the future. It's important to mention that all pods are not suitable candidates for fuel breaks. And that's important to mention. We shouldn't just be going out and treating all pods lines as fuel breaks, but where it makes sense strategically and where it's meant to protect or provide access and increase firefighter safety and effectiveness, and where we can intersect it with some larger landscape scale treatments, it's a nice approach and strategy for moving forward. Okay, next. So this is, I think, the last slide, and this is just an example. I think Wes and Daniel are going to go through some examples on Forest Service land, and I just want to provide an example of a CWPP that has started to incorporate pods just adjacent to the ARP. So this is the Loveland Fire Rescue Authority CWPP. The goal of this CWPP was to develop a coordinated set of treatments across federal and non-federal land. And you can see here in kind of the orangish color, they were hoping to do a combination of these shaded fuel breaks on both sides of pods boundaries and roadside treatments to increase public safety for evacuation. But then you notice the kind of pink blob there is where they're trying to pair those pods treatments along roads with some more landscape scale fuel treatments within those pods for community protection and future fire risk reduction. So this example shows not only how to, one good example, I think, of coordinating a set of treatments on non-federal lands in the ARP, and also thinking about how you might want to prioritize treatments along both pod boundaries and within those pod boundaries. And just the final slide to wrap it up, and then I'll hand it back over, is that pods create this common operating picture for stakeholders, those that have fire management background and knowledge and those that don't. We're often told that pods is a very intuitive concept. And again, fundamentally, it's just about identifying those most effective control features on a landscape. It provides a framework to integrate both land management, fire management, and forest leadership through that collaborative process, bringing a number of stakeholders on board to learn about and get into the weeds about what makes a line a successful line. Helps to kind of provide some cross-pollination between fire management and land management. And in doing so, the goal is to contribute to more risk-informed land management and resource-informed fire response. And I've just listed here some stakeholders that you might want to include, but of course that list can be much more expansive depending on the context. The point is to have a broader constellation of stakeholders engaged and involved, to have these negotiations before smoke is in the air, to understand where you're going to be effective and where you might not be effective in managing fire. And I think that's it, Scott.
Hey, Scott, we got a question from Meg Helford. Do all pods get ground truthed?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I'll let the Forest Service chime in as well, but you know, I mean, the short answer is no. Probably everybody's not going out and ground truthing every pod, but you know, there's a lot of value in it, especially in places where maybe you've put a pod that people aren't quite as familiar with the ground. And we've seen some really good examples. For example, what is it? Is it the Uinta or the Ashley? That's right. The Ashley in Utah developed this cool field maps app that they've been using to actively go out and rate pod lines, identify pod lines for sort of prioritizing treatments and, you know, road improvements and all sorts of things like that. So it's been somewhat variable forest to forest on how that's done.
Yeah, and we, during the mapping session, while Scott and or Jackie are delineating those lines, somebody else will be taking notes and capturing the conversation about the viability of that line. So you don't need to go out and ground truth perhaps a road, but if there's a 2-track that gets pretty sketchy in one area, we'll capture that, and that would be a prime suspect to go out and ground truth and make sure it's a viable line.
Thanks, Tyler. Yeah, this is a good point for us to just kind of take a pause if there's any other questions on that background information before we go through some discussion and examples related specifically to the fire shed. Yeah, go ahead, Meg.
Yeah, on that note, once pods are identified, are you intending to run different fire behavior models, like extreme, very high on those pods with maybe different treatments or densities? Just wondering if you're going to run different modeling to see how they withstand that kind of fire behavior.
Sure. Yeah, well, I think, you know, some of that will lead into a little bit of the modeling I'm about to discuss. So I don't necessarily have plans to run any new fire modeling, but we have a lot of current work that's, at least on our end, come out of the wildfire risk assessment that I'm going to discuss that has modeling under a whole bunch of weather and treatment scenarios. And so all of that modeling can still be applied and analyzed on the newly modified pod network. All right. Everyone's feeling good to keep on moving forward. Like it. All right. So here's my new slide. Let me just pull up my notes. All right, so we're going to go through some examples, as I mentioned, related to the Northern Colorado fireshed, and how some different ongoing processes can be integrated with pods. So to start off, just a little context on this risk assessment that the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, in collaboration with the National Forest and the fireshed, went through over the last couple of years. So I'm sure a good number of people on the call were involved in this process, and I'm not going to dig too much into the methodology, other than to say that this was a really large collaborative process, where we had a ton of different stakeholder engagement meetings, particularly in how we identified which highly valued resources and assets. So which things on the landscape are we concerned about being impacted by fire? So how those were identified and spatially mapped was highly collaborative, as well as how we expect a lot of those resources and assets to respond to wildfire in different intensities. And so the outcome of this modeling effort is essentially a map that shows what's the potential intensity of fire, what is the impacts of that fire, and then what is the probability of those impacts actually coming to bear, to produce a whole range of different maps. I have one on here that is kind of a nice generalized example showing how our process ended up kind of distributing risk across the landscape. It does a nice job of just kind of highlighting some of those hot spots, and then there's a whole bunch of subsequent analyses that you can do with this data. And so here on the map, I have two different QR codes, and I think Chaska can also pop the links in the chat. But one is just to the risk assessment report, and then the other one is to all of the spatial data. So all of the fire modeling, all of the risk modeling, all the HVRA locations that we were able to share. Some of them we weren't able to share for some of like the water resources stuff that is private, isn't on there, but all that data that we're able to share is available on our box for download, so you can do your own secondary analyses. So that's the background of the risk assessment. There's lots of different applications in sort of treatment planning, treatment evaluation, prioritizations that you can do with this data. And then the one that I'm going to talk about is specifically related to pods. So here we go. Next slide, Scott. Analysis that I've been working on recently to support the NOCO fireshed spatial planning is really based around this idea of risk and risk transmission. So you have obviously the risk in a particular location, but then there's also, well, what is the implication of a fire starting there? Where might it spread? What resources and assets might it affect? And we're able to get into some of those spatial components of risk through this FSIM, so the large fire simulator modeling that I did to support the risk assessment. So very briefly, this is a fire model that is stochastic, and it represents thousands of years of potential fire activity based on realistic climate and seasonal weather. And at the end of this simulation, you can create your landscape burn probability maps that some of you are familiar with. And it also has a secondary output of all of the simulated ignitions and fire perimeters. And so working with those ignitions and fire perimeters, you can start to move towards understanding the transmission of risk across the landscape. So I have an example here where, in the context of pods, we might be concerned with, well, if a fire starts in a particular pod, where is it likely to go? What other things is it going to influence? And then you can even tie that risk back to its pod of origin. So this is just an example where, you highlight all of these ignitions in a particular pod. We track where those fires went and what they did. And in that way, we can start to calculate risk across the landscape in a slightly different way than a normal, risk map would. So here's just some different examples of what those outputs look like and different ways that they could be used to inform fire and fuels planning. And right off the top, I'm just going to mention that this is certainly not the end all be all. I love analytics and modeling, but it's really just one piece of data to initiate a conversation to make these decisions. So we don't want to let the model make all our decisions, but it can be a useful framework to get things going. So I kind of alluded to these two different aspects of risk. One I'm calling in situ risk, and that is the risk within a particular pod. So if a fire starts in that pod, what is the potential risk just within that pod? And so when you do that and then you summarize that risk to the pods, you can produce a map like I have here on the right with more of my greens showing areas where we're expecting a beneficial or potentially just a neutral impact of, on average of fires starting in that pod versus the yellows and reds where we have increasingly negative impacts. And so this is just a nice first cut way of understanding, places on the landscape where we might expect wildfire or, larger scale prescribed fire to have positive outcomes. Versus other areas where there are just more risks to consider. And so, thinking about, your potential treatment options, in some of those yellow or red pods, that might be sort of a trigger to emphasize treatments that are really close to your values at risk, to try and reduce that in situ potential impact. And also just to note that, pods are variable. Just because a pod is red, there are certainly still potential prescribed fire opportunities, but it is likely that it's going to be more challenging, and your prescribed fire units might just need to be smaller and very strategically placed to work around some of the places that you won't be able to apply fire to the landscape. So there's our in situ or within pod risk, and then this is the other side of that. So this is the transmitted risk. And so this is, if a fire starts in a given pod, what are the likely impacts outside of that pod? And this is also helpful, particularly in the context of fire management. When you have an ignition, you'd like to be able to kind of rapidly understand where might this go? What are the potential impacts? And so again, I kind of have a first cut here. Once again, just to get conversations going, but we've got some similar green areas where even if a fire starts in that pod, we're not as concerned with it spreading out. Obviously, that's highly conditional, but it gives a sense of how things are distributed on the landscape. So we've got our kind of greens, the yellow areas where there's certainly possibilities for benefits from that fire, but you do have concerns with it transmitting to an area with much higher risk and having negative impacts. And then those red areas where, your first thought is going to be concern and aggressive suppression because you don't want that thing moving around. There's a high probability of having transmitted risk impacts. And so in those areas, in addition to that quick trigger of aggressive suppression, those are also places where you might think about doing those types of pod boundary treatments that Tyler was describing, where the goal is, if we get an ignition in this pod, we really want to increase our chance of keeping it inside of the pod and not letting that risk spill over and transmit across the landscape. And I guess the other thing that I wanted to mention in terms of like the variation within pods, right? Some places might be red, but there's benefits in there as well. To some extent, through this week, if there are opportunities to subdivide pods, that can help clean up a little bit of that variation. But we're only going to do that when the opportunities actually exist. So sometimes there will be really large pods, and that's just reflective of the landscape condition where there aren't any suppression opportunities, and so it's a large pod. But just to highlight the potential benefits of splitting some of these bigger pods up where possible, it can just give us a little bit more of a fine-grained understanding of how risk is distributed on the landscape. And then this last map I wanted to show is just kind of bringing those two concepts together and considering them simultaneously. So when we think about, what is the balance of risk within the pod and the risk of that pod transmitting, we get a little bit of a different map here that really highlights, some of those concepts I just discussed. But where are the places on the landscape where fire is more likely to have better outcomes versus those where any unplanned ignition is going to be a major concern right off the bat. Yeah, and so the idea here is that these maps can be really useful for planning your spatial strategy on the landscape, both of fuels, fuels treatment locations, things like that, as well as your fire planning. And once again, these are just the starting point, right? And you're going to want to go through and not only consider maybe the things that our model is missing, but also the fact that this is extremely conditional and highly dependent on both the weather during the event, the resources available, other dynamic considerations that you're not going to pull out of this static model. And so it's just a way to get conversations moving, and I think paints at least an instructive picture of the landscape, even if it's not our end all. So this is just meant to provide some ideas about how we can link QRA and pods, and as we expand and refine this network, particularly covering some of the areas off towards the east that we don't have in the pod network, we'll be able to better characterize the risk transmission in particular. So yeah, I look forward to rerunning this analysis on our new network. Yeah, that's kind of all I had. So I don't know if we had any questions pop up while I was talking that we want to address now, or we can grab them at the end. Sounds good. All right, so I'm getting a no. So I'm going to pass it now over to Wesley Page, who's going to discuss some of the ongoing fuels planning work.
Hi, everyone. Wesley Page. I am the fuel specialist on the ARP. And I don't have many slides here, just a couple, but I'm going to bring up an example that I think brings together a lot of the pieces that we talked about. So we're very fortunate on the ARP to be working with our partners and have so many of them. So we've got the quantitative wildfire risk assessment that Scott talked about. We had the previous pod workshop that was done. And we're also fortunate in that the bipartisan infrastructure law allocated significantly more funding for fuels treatment, fuels planning, all types of fuels related work on the ARP. Since it's part of the wildfire crisis strategy, it's one of the priority landscapes. So with that money, also was mentioned, there was a new categorical exclusion called the fuel break CE. And so about a year ago, we had just finished our quantitative wildfire risk assessment, and we started asking ourselves where we could initially focus on trying to utilize the money and the new categorical exclusion to do some of this pod boundary type work. And basically through a combination of using some of the outputs from the risk assessment, specifically the probability analysis, so the likelihood of seeing a fire, and coupled with Scott Ritter's work on looking at places where we can have the most change in terms of our fuels treatments and improving suppression difficulty. It identified several project areas. The most obvious one is what's shown here. So just east of Estes Park. This is we call it the Pearson Park project. So there's a big north-south road called Pearson Park that's highlighted there in kind of that neon color blue. Johnny Park Road is on the southern portion of the map here. And what you see is we've got a bunch of old treatments here. They're in those other colors. They're not, you can see they're just kind of out there. They're not really coordinated very well. But using this field break CE and the concepts that we've talked about, we're able to think about designing a treatment or a series of treatments that connect all of these on the landscape and will serve hopefully multiple functions, being improve suppression effectiveness and facilitate future work. So that was the goal with this first field break CE. And it's focused on this Pearson Park area, but you'll see it extends out to the east and the north there. And that's much more fragmented, not by choice, but by ownership. So this is a good example of how important our collaborators are, and helping us fill in those gaps over time is going to be extremely important. But that was the goal, is connect a bunch of old treatments, put them in the right spot, and have some opportunities to work across boundary to fill in the gaps there. So next slide. And so as was mentioned, these are not just purely fuel breaks. The treatment types that we're implementing are mostly shaded fuel breaks. That's the goal, but they're not designed, hopefully, to stand alone. Like in Pearson Park, for example, this is zoomed in here. We've got the Cabin Creek Road there that goes off to the west, and then the Johnny Park Road that goes to the east. Basically, the idea being is once we get this shaded fuel break along the Pearson Park Road, then that provides an anchor for us to continue the work. So just like in the examples that we talked about, looking to the east here, there's an opportunity that's opened up for a bigger landscape scale prescribed fire project that is going to, improve the effectiveness of all that work there. So it's really the culmination of all the previous work that's been done. Tying things together will help us move into a better direction and where we want to go. So I think that's it for that.
I think that transitions to me now. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Daniel Godwin. I'm the sub-regional fire management planning specialist. I'm a fire planner for the Arapaho and Roosevelt National Forest and Pony National Grassland, as well as the Medicine Bow route. And so I've been heavily involved here with the fire shed, as well as the wildfire crisis strategy approach that we're taking here for our landscape. And so, pods are a real fundamental building block for us for everything we're thinking about with WCS. And so, and especially when you start to integrate that with the fire shed, pods are only useful if we agree on them, if we believe in them, and we've done the groundwork together ahead of time, right? And so it's a risk container, but it is also an organizing framework in a lot of ways. And so what we've been doing here around the WCS strategy here is going through this collaborative planning process so that we can identify what our priority pods are for treatment to try and build kind of this common operating picture for collaborative fuels treatment across the fire shed, so that we can strengthen these pod boundaries where we can and really ramp up the opportunity for beneficial fire, particularly prescribed fire at first, but using that to leverage opportunities for less than full suppression on things, or modified suppression techniques, or things like that. And so I think of this in this pyramid approach here, where it all builds on itself together, where at the top there we can start making better management decisions around unplanned ignitions. Next slide, please, Scott. And so through the process over the summer here, we've worked with community connected partners here to identify priority pods, where we say, okay, this is where we want to focus our effort. And then we're starting to drill down further on that, because, if we're thinking about the ribbon here, a ribbon is only effective if it's chunky and long in terms of a fuels treatment, right? We want to have depth to it, and we want to have continuity to it, right? Because if we think about a fire, it can just flow around everything if there isn't continuity and depth, or it can spot over it. And so by identifying where we want to go with our treatments here, we can start working that direction. But, you know, going back to pods are only useful if we all agree on them and we have a shared vision around them. That's the process we're working on here too. So you can see these are the northern half of the forest here. We've gone through this process, and we're continuing to work south into Boulder and Gilpin and Clear Creek County within the wildfire crisis strategy landscape here, which you can see in black. Next slide, please. So then, you know, we do a lot of other, there's a lot of other processes going on under the hood at any given forest, right? So if you're thinking about Smokey's arm, his big burly arm, he's pointing out what the fire danger is on any given day. And that's driven by fire danger operating plans, which have a lot of math under the hood that are going into that. And, you know, it's a collaborative process to figure out breakpoints. But one of the other things within these fire danger operating plans are response areas, right? So it's areas where we've done the you know, the process ahead of time to figure out what we want to send under different conditions, under different staffing levels. And so we'll be going through the process after this series of pod workshops to tie these response areas within the Fort Collins Fire Danger Operating Plan to pod boundaries or clusters of pods. And so we're really trying to start to stack all of this together so that we've got, you know, the pod as a logical unit of analysis for everything that we're doing here. So next slide. And so the goal here really is to engage in safe and effective wildfire response, right? Like that's one of the core elements there, the National Cohesive Strategy. And then we look at the Cohesive Strategy addendum that came out recently, and then the Wildfire Commission report, and there's a big focus on doing more beneficial fire. And so that's using unplanned ignitions for benefit where we can, not like the old school fire use necessarily, but not necessarily full suppression, big hammer on everything. So let's find out where there is space between there to make better decisions so that we're not just transferring all of that risk into the future when we know it's going to be hotter, drier, and probably denser, right? That's going to be a lot harder to do. So let's set ourselves up for success. So, you know, after we've gone through this pod workshop process moving forward, we'll go and look at opportunities and see where does it make sense to put people on the ground where there's higher risk, where there's too much, you know, too many snags based on the fires that have been out there or whatnot, right? And so that's an aggregation of information that we can bake into pods here. And then, like we said, going through and identifying conditions for beneficial fire within pods. So almost like a burn plan, and then figuring out what resources we would need so that when smoke is in the air, because smoke will occur, unplanned ignitions will occur, we've got a plan, right? And we've discussed this with community connected partners and other agency administrators from non-Forest Service agencies out there. And we've come to agreement around what our opportunity space here is, right? And at the end of the day, you know, there's a lot of latitude that comes down to the IC, but we also want to empower the IC to be able to make decisions, knowing that they've got the weight of all of this planning and agreement and coordination behind them to support them to make decisions that aren't necessarily just the big hammer every time, right? And that's what the pods to me are really driving us or supporting, is those kind of outcomes. And that's where I think not only should we go, but we need to be going. I think that's my last slide here. And so I'm going to pass that back to you, Scott. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Wes and Daniel. So yeah, I think we're gonna do like a quick pause here. Before I do, I just want to bring everyone's attention. We just recently here at CFRI published a whole bunch of different examples of pod applications for both fire planning, or rather fire response and fuels planning. So that's the story map link up there. So feel free to check that out. Let's just take a quick pause until 2:20. Just give everybody a moment to stand up. So I'll be back in a minute. All right, I'm back and ready to continue the presentation onto I think everyone's favorite topic, analytics and fire modeling. So yeah, we'll kind of try not to go too deep into the models here, but we found it helpful to give everyone some context on the two primary products, data analytical products that go along with these pod delineation efforts. So Tyler already mentioned a little bit about what these are and what they mean, but we like to work from suppression difficulty index, right? So this is this raster surface showing where it's safer and easier to engage a fire versus areas where it's harder and more hazardous for sort of more direct suppression type activities. And there's also the potential control lines or potential control likelihood analysis, which is showing where your probability of successfully containing the fire is a little bit higher. So as we'll see, these two things show us some different aspects about the landscape. Both of them are modeled at these large ecoregion scales that use the local 90th percentile weather conditions. So these are really large blocks. I think there's about 100 of them across the whole country that have some sort of coherent either fuels and weather conditions enough that they're modeled as a unit. And then all of these ecoregions are mosaicked together to create this kind of seamless these seamless rasters across the country. So suppression difficulty index, without digging into the formula, basically what you have here is on the top of our equation are the factors that make fire suppression either more challenging or more dangerous, primarily being driven by the fire behavior and then the slope steepness. So fire behavior is measured both with modeled flame lengths, as well as the heat release per unit area, which is capturing a little bit more of the overall fuel load, some of those heavy fuels that contribute a lot to just the total energy release of the fire, if not directly to flame length. So we got our fire behavior, and then slope. As you'll see when we look at some of these examples, slope is a really strong driver in this model of places that are just very challenging and dangerous to work. And then those factors that make it hard are balanced by some of the things that help us out as firefighters. So accessibility, what's the road density and distance to a particular road, penetrability, which is this measurement of how challenging it is to move across the ground, and then fire line construction rate, which is calculated based on the surface fuel model. So essentially, how much effort or how long does it take to construct fire line in a given location. So those are the factors going into the model. You can dig into this paper if you want to read a little bit more about it, and we'll see some examples of the model. So that's suppression difficulty index. The potential control location or potential control line analysis is a little more complex, but essentially it's this machine learning algorithm that looks at all of the historical fires within a given ecoregion, and where those fires stopped. And so basically for each fire, it's either a 0 where the fire did not stop, or 1 where the fires did stop. And then it looks at all of these predictor variables that are all mapped spatially across the landscape. So resistance to control, that's about line construction. Suppression difficulty index is an input into the model as well. Modeled rate of spread. You have these road influence, so how far is it from a particular road? Barrier influence, how far are you from non-burnable? So whether that's an alpine ridgeline or a water body or a large river. Cost distance is another measurement of how hard it is to get ground resources in. Your topographic variables, so ridges, valleys, steep slopes, flat slope or flat ground, things like that, and then the prior burning. So how long ago was there a previous fire on a given location? And then so our output is this probability surface that does its best to relate those historical fire occurrences to where you might be likely to contain a future fire. So this is just an example of what the ecoregions look like around the ARP area. So the ARP or the Arapaho Roosevelt side is all in this Southern Rockies ecoregion, and then there's a separate High Plains and Nebraska Sand Hills ecoregion that characterizes basically everything to the east of essentially where the timberline stops and the Great Plains begin. So those are the relevant landscape models for this workshop. So in the Southern Rockies, I'll just start off by saying that the model data set for these fires, there's a lot of large fires that were very challenging to control that do a lot of the driving in this model. But the top 3 predictor variables were modeled rate of spread, distance to road, and then resistance to control, which once again is about that fuel model type and how hard it is to put line in a given fuel model type. So I'm going to keep cruising. We don't need to go into the partial dependency plots on this one. And as soon as I say that, now I want to tell you about them, but they're just showing how far away from each of these variables it still has an effect. So you can see how far the road influence is here. So in the Great Plains region, the road influence is out to maybe something like 4,000 meters before it flattens off and is less influential in the model. So that's what those plots are telling us. There's a whole report on these that I'd be happy to share with anybody. But so back to the top 3 variables driving the Great Plains model. It's barriers, so non-burnable barriers. roads, and then this measurement of firefighter access. So that's probably pretty intuitive in those types of grass fires where your roads and your non-burnable areas are really strong control features. All right, so that's what the model statistics are. I think at this point I've just got some examples. We can just look at some different areas on the landscape and get a sense of how they map out. So here's suppression difficulty index in the Estes Park and showing a bunch of that Pearson Park area that we saw before. Or actually, I guess only some of it down here on the south, but nonetheless, you can see how strongly driven this is by slope. Particularly in our canyons where we have these really steep slopes. Those are just challenging and unsafe places to put firefighters, and that's just really what this map is reflecting. And then this is what the potential control line analysis looks like for the same area. And just to highlight that it's really picking up strongly on the roads and some of the river corridors. And then, once you get into the more continuous timber, it's all pretty low control, once again, under a slightly more extreme weather condition. And this is just reflective of the large fires we've seen on the landscape that, have spread across all different types of barriers and have made containment rather tricky on those, those more extreme days. So then just a couple more kind of side-by-side examples where we can start to think about what different things these metrics are telling us. So I have another example over here of the Grand Lake area, heading into the sort of west side of Rocky Mountain National Park. And I think one thing that pops out to me on here is just the slope influence on suppression difficulty. So you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's this area. No, you can't. But essentially up on kind of the ridge tops here where things are flatter, suppression difficulty index is dropping off, but the potential control is still quite high. So that indicates that maybe there's some areas there where you could directly put firefighters, but you'd want to be very cognizant of the weather, because obviously, it may be safe to operate, but you don't necessarily have a great chance of control when the weather picks up. So yeah, I mean, not too much to say. I think it's just nice to have an opportunity to look at some side-by-sides, and we'll have a lot more chance to dig into these metrics as we go. While I have this slide up, I don't know if anybody has any questions on the analytics. We can just take another moment to look at them.
Not in the chat, and I don't see any hands raised, but.
Sounds good. Okay, well, that's the overview. Like I said, there's way more details in some of those academic papers, but I'll just say that this is, as I mentioned about all the risk transmission stuff, right? This is just a starting point for conversations. In general, we've found, in conversations kind of all across regions 2 and 4 with a whole bunch of firefighters that, in many cases, these maps align relatively well with their experience, but they certainly don't override the need for all of your local input in the coming mapping sessions. So yeah, hopefully people find some value in these, knowing that math can't do everything for us. Cool. So last slide I have on here, we'll see a lot more of this as we get into our mapping this week. But these are just some of the different layers that I will have ready to go for reference, as we're working on revising the pod. So, we'll have our forest base map. I've got the visitor maps for the Arapaho Roosevelt, WUI and structural locations, all the historical fire and fuels treatment work, our roads and trails networks, those two, suppression difficulty index and potential control layers, topography, super important. And then we have fire management units on there. Some forests still had the older fire management units that we've used before to have as a starting point. And I'll have some other stuff as well, things like vegetation type, fuel model, anything else we might think to look at as we're going through the mapping. So that's my analytics, and I'm going to keep talking a little bit after this. So maybe we'll just save questions if we have anything else at the end. But yeah, so I just got a few more comments on our next steps, and then we'll be able to kind of wrap up for today, barring more discussion, which we would certainly welcome. So we've all seen this slide. This is just kind of a review of what we're going to be doing this week. But really, we're excited to have an opportunity to facilitate a really collaborative process. In the past, some of these workshops, not necessarily here, but in certain places, have been very Forest Service centric. So we're excited to have a lot of other cooperators in the room to help discuss all of these lines as we combine our analytical knowledge and all of our deep experience on the landscape in developing and revising the current networks. So yeah, it should be good. I think we've got a lot of people registered to come. So yeah, we'll have a bunch of really good discussions throughout the week. So I've got our schedule up here. So tomorrow we're going to be down in Golden, doing the mapping kind of on the south side. So in the morning we'll be focused in on Gilpin, Clear Creek, and the northern portion of Jefferson County, which covers the Clear Creek Ranger District. And then also just bringing things further east, off forest, as we mentioned. And then the afternoon will be more focused in on Boulder County, some of Southern Rocky Mountain National Park. And once again, bringing that east all the way. And then Wednesday, we're going to be doing more Larimer County focused mapping in Johnstown. We'll kind of see how long all that mapping takes, and then on Thursday we're heading over to Granby to do Grand County Western National Park, and we also will have some representation from the White River and the Route National Forests to look at their pods as they interact with the network all throughout Grand County, and perhaps a little outside the county, just to make sure everything's all kind of edge matched and in alignment, with our adjacent national forests. So once we've gone through all of that mapping, we've got some longer term next steps. The first thing, we're going to do a very kind of quick and dirty cleaning, if you don't mind that language, to just have a network to provide for Daniel and some of the more short term crisis strategy related planning. And then over the next couple of months, we're going to go through with a fine-tooth comb and really clean up the data to make sure the pod lines are well aligned with the feature they're intended to be. We're going to make sure they're traced along roads and things like that, just because there is some value in having a really tight, well mapped network for subsequent analyses and just for clear communication on where the line is actually meant to be, because sometimes they're a little bit rougher. So that fine-tooth cleaning will happen over the next couple of months. As I said, right away, we're going to be ready to integrate these new networks with some decision-making and prioritization processes, continue to work and improve the validation and attribution of the lines, the whole process of sharing with partners, getting them out there for people to start working with, in their fuels planning, whether that's locally or within the forest. And then, we'll continue as we have to evaluate both uses and values of these pod networks, how they're informing decisions, how they align with wildfire outcomes, all sorts of stuff like that. So yeah, that's the longer term. I'm excited to see a bunch of people in all these mapping sessions. Should be a busy week. So if you have any questions or you need any more information about the meetings, certainly feel free to reach out to me. I've got my email here on the last slide, or Chaska is available as well. But we'd love to see you, and yeah, happy to have some more discussion if there's questions or anything else we want want to chat about now, but I think that's everything that we had on our end for the presentation.
Thanks so much, Scott. I dropped a bunch of links in the chats. If anybody has not been able to see the chat or access those, please let me know. But otherwise, we can open it up for some questions.
I have one quick question. This is Meg. And I'm sorry if you already said this. So is the anticipated date of this being updated and available? As you all know, I'd like to incorporate it into the Boulder County CWPP. By next summer, this will be available to have this updated data.
Certainly, yeah. So we'll very shortly after the workshops, we'll have a rough version to just support, primarily I think Daniel's kind of planning, and then within a couple of months we'll have the final network all cleaned up. So yeah, certainly by this summer, and by the spring, the updated network will appear on the RMA dashboard, and we're going to work with both the forest and the region to make sure that it's in alignment with the regional network and up onto all of the relevant platforms.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? People are pod overload, potted out.
I think it's where you lower level position, then you just start getting down.
I don't think we're meant to hear that. Okay, well,
show up a few minutes early if you're coming in person to the workshop so we can get started on time over the next few days. All the details, including addresses, are in that last document that I added. And I will also send a follow-up email after this workshop with a link to the recording to everybody that I have registered and or have emails that have been involved in the thread for these workshops. Daniel or Jason, do you have any parting thoughts?
No, just wanted to thank you, Chaska and Scott, for leading the session today, and thank you to all the different speakers and presenters for teeing up what's to come the rest of the week, and look forward to these day sessions as we dive in a little deeper and go from there.
Great, thanks, Jason. If you have any last minute questions, you can always email me or Scott, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Otherwise, we will see you starting tomorrow at the Golden Hotel. Right,
thanks everybody for your attention to this important stuff.
all right. Well, thanks. We'll see everyone this week.
Woohoo! All right, take care.